Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video will be a review of Kino Lorber's Blu-ray release of the 1933 PreCode horror film from the Paramount library, Supernatural, with Carole Lombard and Randolph Scott. This was directed and produced by the Halperin brothers after their great smash success with the classic PreCode horror film White Zombie, which Kino has also released on Blu-ray and I reviewed on this channel. This film, Supernatural, has had very little in terms of video releases. There was a Universal VHS tape in the 90s, which is quite uncommon. Then it got an MOD DVD release, and then surprisingly this Blu-ray release, which is credited to a new 2K restored master of sorts. This is a very interesting film, like all PreCode horror films, and like a good number of them, it's sort of a mix and match affair between different genres, so it's not out and out horror 100% of the way through. It does take a number of turns, and it also is quite short. In fact, the runtime is literally 64 minutes, so it is very brisk, and since it is from the Halperin brothers, it is very, very much reminiscent of White Zombie. So if you've ever seen White Zombie and wondered how it would have been if the Halperins had gone to a major studio and been coaxed into making another horror film, that's Supernatural. It basically is a lot of White Zombie with a Paramount gloss. It's also got a lot in common with the other sort of horror films that Paramount was doing at this time. Of course, they just had their smash success with the 1931 Ruben Mamoulian directed Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Frederick March, and that's what he won the Oscar for. So there is quite a bit of Jekyll and Hyde once you get to the final act of this film. And it also has quite a deal of a similar feeling with a little dash of the lurid of another iconic PreCode Paramount horror film that had just recently come out, which of course was 1932's Murders in the Zoo, one of the most notoriously lurid of all PreCode horror films. So this film unfortunately does not have a gleefully bloodthirsty Lionel Atwill as Murders in the Zoo does, but it does have the absolute screen legend Carole Lombard in one of her earlier roles where she was sort of ascending the ladder to stardom, but still before her real breakthrough performance 2 years later in Howard Hawks' classic 20th Century. But it's strange thinking of Carole Lombard in a sort of horror vehicle, and especially in the PreCode era. So the film story it breaks down as this, and of course, trying to describe it, it sounds a bit more complicated than it is, and the film has a very short runtime. So unfortunately, for the supernatural elements and the themes of possession, it takes so long to get there that by the time you do, it's basically only the last 20 minutes where you get to all the fun, meaty stuff. But Supernatural, the film, basically deals with a corrupt medium and his attempts to get in with an heiress whose twin has just died, leaving her the entire family fortune while she is in the period of her intense grieving. And the film opens with a former associate of the corrupt medium being on death row for murdering all of her would-be male suitors and still wanting to get her revenge on the person who got away, and that being our corrupt medium friend. So, of course, in the midst of all of this, H.B. Warner plays a psychologist or scientist of some sorts who has some crazy experimental idea, and he wants to have permission to mess around with the murderess's corpse once she's dead. So he is apparently playing around with the themes of soul possession and trying to preserve the life force after death, which is a classic science fiction and horror theme, but it's sort of whimsically ham-fisted into the story, so it does make you chuckle a little bit. But this is how we get to the eventual idea of the heroine of this film, the Carole Lombard character, potentially being possessed by the spirit of a murderess. And because it's a PreCode film, the opening that gives the background to the murders, there is a nice lurid undertone and a nice newspaper headline montage. And it does move with a sort of brisk pace because it is only an hour and 4 minutes. But you go in knowing that this is one of the first films to possibly deal with possession and it takes so long to get there that, again, as I said, you basically have to wait until the last 20 minutes. But there is some nice build up to that, and you do have some really great stalwart, fantastic actors in H.B. Warner and Randolph Scott in sort of the throwaway love interest supporting character role, very similar to actually he's playing sort of the same role that he did in Murders in the Zoo. And of course, the whole time he's on screen, you're just thinking, oh wow, that's Randolph Scott, and you're not even thinking about he doesn't really have anything to do. So it's sort of the Jonathan Harker from Universal's Dracula type role of being the juvenile lead and just worrying so much about what's happening to his betrothed and not really having much to do. Again, as I mentioned, there is the idea of possession going on, and it's the otherworldly aspects along with the surprising number of optical effect shots and the sort of eerie quality that the Halperins bring to this film that really set it apart and put it firmly in the horror genre and definitely link it to White Zombie. There's even the same sort of usage of the very intensive sort of spectral eyes and a lot of transitions and montage sequences. It's very similar, if not identical, to the iconic shots of Bela Lugosi's eyes that are frequently used throughout White Zombie in the same way. So you can see the same visual parallels. The films also shared the same cameraman as well. So again, it's very much White Zombie with a Paramount gloss, with a lot of the rough, independent edges of the previous film sort of worked and rubbed off because they had an actual budget at a studio and at Paramount, no less. The film's really standout moments are the ones that are the eeriest, and the ones that have the most impact are the seance sequence that is built up to with the corrupt and conniving spiritualists, and then shortly after that when the Lombard character is actually possessed by the spirit of this murderess that we saw in the opening. And this is what you watch the film for. Again, it's unfortunate it takes place really only in the last 20 minutes, but Lombard's performance is really well done. It's very well modulated, and she can do so much with just the lift of an eyebrow, and her performance is completely different to what we see previously of the very emotional and grieving twin sister of the male twin who has died that we never see. And that express difference in the two sides of this performance really helps sell this idea of possession. And the best scenes in the film are when it is invoking the spirit of the dead murderess, and what I think is the highlight of the film, when the Lombard character possessed by this avenging spirit drags the spiritualist back to places where they had been before, particularly the dead woman's apartment, and in a wonderful macabre touch, she's looking at him with full-on PreCode eyes, I think is the best way to put it, and they start drinking, and then she goes over and pulls this sheet off of this large object, and it is a full nude portrait of the dead woman, and she's standing next to it just staring at him, and so she and the painting are staring at this guy, and he understandably starts to get really freaked out, but of course he doesn't go away immediately, as any sensible person would. And it's that deliciousness of the final scenes of the Lombard character possessed and the spiritualists that are worth the cost of admission. So this is Carole Lombard's picture. It is that's what you come to this for, and there is a rather nice, very PreCode ending, as all great PreCode horror films got. This is definitely a film you could not have made in the same way once the production code really took into effect late the next year in 1934. It is unfortunately rather short on characterization outside of the Lombard character, because this is only 64 minutes long, and it is still the same guys who made White Zombie. So it does have some of the same pitfalls and shortcomings of White Zombie, but it does have a lot of that same really eerie atmosphere that even starts right in the opening titles with this sort of spooky, spectral, choral voice effect just wailing over the main titles. So it is, and again, it's so short that it's a perfect film to slot in your annual Halloween viewing, and it is essential for people who want to know how the horror film developed and how it developed in the talkies, and especially for fans who love looking at pre-code horror films, which there are, there's a good number of them, but there's not as many as you would think, and it was still rare for Paramount and some of the other studios to try and dip their toes into horror. So this is one of those films where they tried to dip their toes in, and it does have horror elements, but it's also sort of soft pedaling it a little bit so they could still sell this as a mystery thriller or as a thriller of the occult. So they could sell it a number of ways. So ultimately, I think it's a fascinating film, and it's so short that you can't help but like it. And if you love White Zombie, as I do, in spite of its shortcomings, then this is a natural follow-up, and it's a must-see for fans of all pre-code horror films. And it's a must-see for Carole Lombard fans, because this is one of the showiest roles that she had, again, before her breakthrough in 20th Century. And it's fascinating seeing her play the two different sides, and doing a rather nuanced performance for each of these, because they're two distinct characters. And honestly, the only other thing that comes to mind in terms of this, besides the sort of, we're making a female Jekyll and Hyde, which Paramount did try to use in the marketing, it does have a little bit of the feeling that you get in the great classic horror film The Black Room from 1935, where Boris Karloff had one of his best roles in his career, playing the two twins, and then having the third role when the evil twin assumes the identity of the good twin, once of course he's killed him, as all evil twins seemingly do to the good twins. So there's a little tinge of that for classic horror fans, but getting to see it from the female perspective. And again, this is unfortunately minor, because you do have to wait until the last 20 minutes of a 64-minute feature, but there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of grisly, nice pre-code horror elements. So I think it's a fantastic little blend of White Zombie, Murders in the Zoo, with a little dash of the 31 Jekyll and Hyde. In fact, there's one scene where I swear it's the same staircase from the 31 Jekyll and Hyde that led to the prostitute Ivy's apartment in the 31 Jekyll and Hyde. Well, I think it's that same exact staircase that gets reused as the stairs to the rundown apartment of the murderous spiritualist. So it's got great atmosphere. It has a nice eeriness to it, and I think it's essential for pre-code horror fans. So now we come to the 2020 Kino Lorber Blu-ray release with this gorgeous artwork. This is reused from one of the original one-sheet posters. This is what more and more labels should do. When you have original art like this, why bother with anything else? It's in the standard Kino design, and it is credited as from a new 2K master. And this, from Universal, I assume is something they did, and then Kino's just using their master. So I guess maybe this was created and first used on that MOD DVD release, but that would just be my guess, because before that, all there was a VHS tape. Now, in terms of the quality, it is pretty impressive looking for what it is and for the age and vintage of this film. It has not been fully restored, of course. There are frequent bits of frame wobble. There's the occasional line. There are some occasional hairs and things. And there are a couple spots of visible damage you will see. There's even some in the opening titles. But that is commonplace to masters where titles from this era have not been given full overhaul and complete restoration. So that's understandable. It doesn't detract from the viewing experience, because this film itself is quite a rare film to see, and I'm amazed it got a Blu-ray release. I'll put that out there. It is a little bit soft in places, but I think that is intrinsic to the original production. There are some occasional optical shots, which again are obviously going to be a little bit softer. That's just intrinsic to the way the film was made, so that's understandable. The audio is lossless DTS HDMI mono, and on the surface it sounds okay and what you would think a film of this era would sound like, but it does seem like it has an awful lot of noise reduction going on. So much so that when there's dialogue, you hear natural hiss under the voices and such, but then when they stop talking, all of a sudden, all that hiss is gone. Almost like you hear a sort of whirring effect when people stop talking. So there is still some hiss and noise in the track when there's no dialogue, but I could definitely tell it seemed like there was quite a heavy-handed amount of noise reduction going on. And so much so that made me wonder if somehow that was baked into the original source or something, because it has a sort of it gives the dialogue a sort of echoey chamber type effect, and it was really strange to hear in the opening sequences when people would stop talking, a little sort of whirring sound, and all of a sudden the noise floor dropped, and it was just really bizarre. So I don't know if it's something baked into the original audio source, or if it's just an extremely heavy-handed case of noise reduction on a modern master. I would lean towards that, but again, I have not had a lot of experience with this film, and I don't own the previous copies on VHS and DVD, so that would just be me hazarding a guess. But you will notice that if you have a good speaker system, because it is very, very obvious. In fact, I think this is the most glaring difference I've seen in terms of varying noise in a audio release of any film I can think of in the recent past that I've looked at on disc. Because in fact, when I first started watching this, I actually stopped the film and rewound it a couple times just to make sure I wasn't hearing things, because it was just that much of a spike in levels every time there was dialogue. Again, it would just be me guessing, but it seems like either there was really heavy noise reduction or the original audio source is severely compromised, which could also make sense because White Zombie itself has had many element problems and different restorations and still does not have a definitive release on video. So thankfully, Supernatural does not have all of the myriad of problems that White Zombie has had, but I think it is important to note the severe level discrepancies in the audio track. The disc itself is just your standard Kino labeled disc, but this does have an actual special features section. So we get the original trailer in HD, which is always nice to be able to see, and you can compare the trailer's presentation quality to the main feature transfer. But we get a brand new Tim Lucas audio commentary, which is worth the purchase of the whole disc alone. Even though it's a 64-minute film, Tim Lucas talks about the film, its production, its stars, its background, the Halperin brothers, White Zombie a little bit, PreCode horror films, supernatural thrillers, and thrillers of the occult. And for me, especially, the best part was when he touched upon other bits of media around the same time that were dealing with similar subjects, and he specifically mentions one of the classic Shadow pulp stories. And so, me being a giant Shadow fan, it was just like, yes, somebody understands. So that was a nice little thrill, and all of Tim Lucas's commentaries are so worth your time. He is one of the best commentators working today, and of course is already a legendary figure in the video and film realms with his classic Video Watchdog magazine and all the various projects he's done over the years. So seeing that he's done a commentary for something is one of those names you see and you're like, yes, I can purchase this disc just because I know the commentary is going to be really worthwhile. And again, this is a 64-minute film, and this is still an outstanding commentary. So if this is all at all interesting to you, getting the Tim Lucas commentary is the icing on the cake, and this is still an affordable standard Kino Lorber release, so that just makes it all the more enticing. And this isn't just for classic horror fans. This is also a must-own title for Carole Lombard fans, because this, again, is one of her best roles while on the ascendancy to stardom before 20th century. Supernatural, on this Blu-ray release from Kino Lorber, is a truly interesting PreCode horror film where you have the independent Halperin brothers making another horror film, but at Paramount. So it's sort of like White Zombie, but it's also a Paramount film and has elements of other PreCode horror classics. And it's got a really standout showy role for Carole Lombard in her pre-stardom days. So I think it's a fascinating film that has been very difficult to see. It is rarely discussed, and it was a film that I had read about many times but had just never gotten the chance to see until now with this release. And also, I really enjoyed the Tim Lucas commentary. So I think this is essential for Lombard fans and an absolute must-own disc for classic horror fans, specifically of White Zombie and the pre-code horror era. So even though I do think the master is, it's good for what it is. This film hasn't had a full-on restoration and doesn't really have the reputation that would probably mean that would ever likely happen, unfortunately. So this is probably the best the film will ever look and sound on disc. I just wish the audio portion, the audio track itself, didn't have that severe hiss reduction going on. But again, I don't know, that might possibly be baked into the source. But outside of that, I do think this is a fantastic release for all classic horror nerds, and it's a must if you're looking for more classic horror releases on Blu-ray. So that's it for this review. I hope this has been fun and at least somewhat informative. And as always, I just want to say, keep supporting boutique labels and studio labels, keep your disc spinning, keep physical media alive, and thanks ever so much for watching.